Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where we talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about Riverdale Season 7, Episode 5. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, I appreciate the very Tales of the Crypt inspired episode. Obviously, it's like a massive homage to Tales of the Crypt, but I think it's so interesting because I don't know whether it's just kind of leaning into like horror cheesiness, like old school horror cheesiness, or just like, because obviously like some of like this, not just like the scenarios, because obviously it's like, but I wonder is that them really kind of putting on, because to me I'm like, oh, I appreciate it because it has this kind of cheesiness to it, whereas I feel like obviously, because you can almost make a direct parallel to the beginning of last season with the Riverdale situation. Obviously, that ended up being an overarching thing, and I figured this would still have some overarching implications, but it is like 4 stories, I guess arguably 5 if you count like the real world stuff with like Jughead and Veronica. But yeah, it's like 4 stories in comparison to the Riverdale situation, which was 5 parts told over the course of the beginning of season 6, which also interesting too, considering like the final part to that, like the conclusion of the Riverdale part, even though once again it continued throughout the arc of the season, it was episode 5, and this being that same that feels like that was 2 on purpose. But either way, essentially, Jughead is writing some comics for Pep Comics, and the editor, the main dude at Pep Comics, is like, "Yo, we need 4 stories, and they need to be done like overnight, so you can turn them in tomorrow." And Jughead's up for the challenge, and he's spending time with Veronica, who wants to spend time with him. It's like, "Hey, let's go watch this very particular movie," but he's writing up his comics, and each one is once again very Tales of the Crypt inspired. You even have your pseudo Crypt Keeper, the Key Keeper, being kind of like your narrator throughout the stories. So, I mean, first and foremost, like, I mean, it's a sad situation of any bullying situation. Dalton Doyley being put in that position because, like, well, the coach was kind of rough on all the players, but because he, you know, it's like, oh, why'd you even join the team if you're not really that athletic, if you're going to be holding us back? But for him, it's like, oh, the camaraderie. He wanted to be part of a team. And, of course, Julian was going to be the one that leads the charge, would end up locking him in a locker, but he's extremely claustrophobic, and it basically made him snap. And got to keep your head in the game, and ends up beheading everyone, and then, you know, making... It's even more twisted when you actually look at the notion of the only time he started hitting the baskets was making the shots is with the severed head. So, and also I felt like there was a running theme in these two, with the exception of 2, but maybe you could still make the argument. Archie kind of got the rough, not kind of, he definitely got the rough end of the deal in, no, not story 2, story 3 is the one I'm thinking of. Gets the rough end of the deal in every story, and you almost go like, that feels like that was on purpose. But, you know, going back to the Riverdale situation, maybe that was by design, because Archie was in every, like, obviously, like, he played some decently major, he played a major role in every one of the stories. But at least in Riverdale, he was only in the first part because he got sacrificed at the end of part 1, so he wasn't in the other 4 parts. So maybe that was almost supposed to be that compensation a little bit. So that was so interesting too, and I think this speaks volumes that, like, the only character outside of the main 4 that it really... I mean, obviously we got Dalton Doyley, but that's still even directly connected to, like, Julian, but it's still, like... I'd still put Cheryl in that sense, but, like, the stories all revolved around our main 4. Was kind of like, yeah, but, and Cheryl. So Cheryl and Julian were like the only other like recurring characters, and there's like no Tabitha and stuff like that, which now I'm almost wondering, I'm sure that was also by design too, and I think that speaks volumes. Especially later on when Veronica's like, oh, like, because, you know, people use comics to tell their stories. It's meant to be, there's deeper layers to it. It can be a thing of, you know, a comic can be political. It can be a representation of what someone believes or what they stand for. So you can understand why Veronica kind of feels the way she does after, like, he starts telling the stories that he, you know, ends up telling. But like I said, we'll continue going down them. The second one was about, which once again is kind of leaning into those 50s, like, giving into your lustful nature and stuff like that. Which Veronica was kind of almost like, is it really that bad to be kind of giving into your lustful needs? But yeah, like the second story was, hey, this kid breaks down at this house. I was thinking it was going to go down a different way. First and foremost, I'm like, hey, is that Nana Rosa's first appearance of the season? I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Because I'm like, in retrospect, I'm like, at the house, the only people we see is because Nana Rose might not be around anymore, like in the 50s. Because I'm like, could we see Clifford and Penelope, but I know I could be mistaken. Maybe I'm misremembering. I don't think we've seen Nana Rose so far. I feel like I might have referenced that before, but it's like, yeah, we got her in this episode, which is so interesting considering like she was directly connected to the. She had her own story to play in the Riverdale thing, but that's why I started getting that vibe of like, are they going to make kind of like a Nana Rose and Archie thing happen? And my initial thought was like, oh, is she gonna be like a succubus or something like that, where it's like, hey, I make myself young again by like stealing the life force of someone. That's where I was going, but I was also like, he is a high schooler, and they're not like, I don't think we know what. They're not seniors, are they? I don't think they are. I think they're back to being like freshman, sophomore again. I think they've said it and I just don't remember. But I'm like, nah, it wouldn't be an appropriate age for that to happen. But that's why I was like, I thought she was... Initially my brain was like, are we going down to section? I was like, I don't think they would, because that'd probably be weird. I mean, to be fair, they've done, Archie's storyline with an older woman, I mean, at the very beginning of the series, but, obviously that was not a consensual situation, considering she was the older woman in the situation and she was a teacher. It's an abuse of power. But the whole conversation, my shift away from that, just thinking like, oh, is she just going to take your life force? And is that how she becomes young Cheryl? Which to me, I'm like, oh, that's just kind of a parallel of the whole Abigail situation and the Riverville situation at the beginning of the season. So, either way. But yeah, like that whole, like, and especially with, like, the craziness of, like, she loves to touch, young men, referencing Cheryl, and Archie's like, oh, really? And just, making the whole point of, like, leaving the door unlocked and open, and it's like, hey, what's going to happen? Especially when she was like, oh, don't turn the lights on. That's why I was wondering, like, what's up with that? That's why I felt like the Nana Rose probably played a role in, but it was like, no, it's because she ended up getting leprosy, and basically her skin is falling off, and it's contagious. Because even I was like, that's kind of jacked up that Nana Rose would do that. Especially, but it's like in her mind, because I was about to say, like, because it's kind of jacked up that you would invite people to stay here knowing that she has, because she doesn't tell Archie about the leprosy thing until like the next day after him and Cheryl went all the way. So I was like, that's super jacked. Like, why would you put someone in that situation without telling them what's what? I mean, yes, it's on him because he left the door. Like, you warned him not to, give into his desires and stuff. But it's also because Nana Rose is doing that on purpose because Cheryl doesn't have much time. So she wants that little bit of time she has left to be joyous and, being able to touch and feel something good because, every other aspect of her life is kind of pain considering all this. So, yeah, Archie's going to be in the same situation. Oh, because she planned it out too because she put the nails in the road. It's also like, it's like, oh, you wouldn't have to worry about it if you had just locked your door. But it's like, no, you gave into your sinful desires. So that's where you kind of go, oh, okay, Jughead. And once again, maybe it's just that 50s mentality of just kind of like frowning upon sex. So there's that. Story number 3, having Betty represented in the way she was, which is so interesting too, because once again, it's like, I mean, we don't know how close this Jughead is with like everyone else. Like, we know Archie's like his best friend, but other than that, like, we don't know like how really tight he is with. I mean, he's probably like on good enough terms. I don't know if we've never really showcased like is he on really great terms with everyone else in the show. I mean, we know him and Archie are great friends, but even then, it's like, even they haven't really been around each other a lot this season so far. But yeah, like, the fact is he would depict Betty in that way. Like, yes, it's a story, but it almost feels like there's something more to it. Once again, Veronica can read a little between the lines, because it's like, oh, made Betty this person. And I get it. It's like, hey, she's got the girl next door thing going on, but I'm so, like, plain and no one notices me, so I want to spice things up, which I felt like that was kind of like a horror twist on, like, maybe, like, Hairspray, like, because of the play and everything. It's not called... Is it Hairspray or is it just called Hair? No, because those are two different... I think those are two different plays. Because I know there's the movie from like the early-ish to mid 2000s with I know one of the main people in it's John Travolta. I can't remember the rest of the cast. I think so. Like, but I think it was a play first and then got adapted into a movie. Once again, like it definitely had Hairspray vibes, especially with the motif revolving around Hairspray and her having like this beehive hair, and she finally gets to stand out. Everyone's finally noticing her, even those who are envious of her, like feeling that envy. It felt nice to be noticed, and then eventually, apparently, a spider like crawled into her hair, laid a whole bunch of eggs, and they ended up devouring her brain. I also love it's also our first pop up of Dr. Curdle Jr.'s, because I brought that up previously of we're no one's really tight with like the coroner. It's like, well, the OG Riverdale squad in the original world and everything in the original time had to get pretty tight with him, especially Betty and Jughead, considering they'd have to go to him all the time with all the murder and death that took place in Riverdale. But it's like, yeah, this was the first like big like gruesome thing that's happened in Riverdale that we're aware of in this time frame and stuff. So no one's on tight terms with Dr. Curdles Jr., so for this to be his first appearance as well. And, cutting open Betty's hair. I don't know if he even got to her head. He just cut through the beehive. And obviously it's like, you'd almost expect it to be bugs, but I guess that would be too, it is bugs. Arachnids, but still, like, I thought it'd be like bees or something but I guess it'd be too literal, but it still kind of was a hive because it was a whole bunch of, like, spiders. Do spiders have, like, well, because, like, a army of bees is a hive, isn't it? Because I was about to say, is there a terminology for, like, a large amount of spiders? Once again, the one that everyone goes to, it's like what is a flock of birds called? Birds in general are called flocks, but, a group of crows is called a murder, so I wonder, do spiders have a jacked up name like that? Either way, so there's that. And obviously, once again, didn't really hit Veronica the best way. It's just kind of like, oh, that's kind of, once again, it's like you're also depicting Betty in like such a shallow way, and she's not that way at all. But the fourth story, it's like, Veronica was suggesting something a little more romantic, and he went down the horror route with his romanticism, and it's like, right, instead of with a situation of a love triangle, rather than it be a thing that the girls are kind of at each other's throat, which even though he was making a point that it wasn't going to be that, it still kind of was to some extent. But I guess it's like you kind of lean into that trope so you can get to what the ending of the story ended up being. But and also once again, doesn't depict Archie in the best light. Part one, it's like, well, Archie, because Archie's the do-gooder that he is, but we haven't really fully showcased that, but the Archie we know is kind of good at heart, and he would never kind of sit on the sidelines and let someone kind of get bullied like that. He was kind of like, yeah, I don't think we should do this, but he just kind of accepted it, so let his head getting cut off. Going for getting all sex crazy and wanting touch and giving into your carnal desires got you leprosy in episode 2. It's like, well, you didn't really get screwed over episode 3, but maybe it's like, well, it took you noticing it's also the parallel of, hey, you only just noticed Betty, you had never really seen her in that light until Cheryl kind of nudged you in that direction last episode. But it's also she was just so plain, she was just your friend. We don't know what they're like in this story or not, but now Archie's paying her attention, and in that moment she ended up dying from the spiders. So it's just it's like how much of Jughead pulling from what's kind of going on in his friends' lives, even though he makes it seem like he doesn't know, because it's like, oh, he didn't know about Cheryl and Archie not going all the way, but he's like, oh, well, he can keep up with all these horny teens around and stuff like that. So that was kind of his brush off of it. But yeah, in this one, Archie's kind of a playboy. It's obviously leaning into the thing that's always been a thing, obviously in the comics as well, of Archie, Betty, and Veronica, that love triangle. Obviously personifying it and making Archie a scumbag in this regard, because he's openly dating both, but saying, sweet talking both of them by being like, hey, you gotta hit them with the 3 words. you're my favorite. And it's like, man, that's such a scumbag thing to say. I love Doily pointing out, because even I thought, I was like, well, your is a contraption, so it's like, I mean, would you even count that? Like, yes, it's a contraption, but it's still contracted into one word, so it still would be applicable to one word. Yes, it means you are, but you're still saying your, so it is a contraction, but it's still one word. I'm actually curious from a grammatical standpoint, does your technically count as, I mean, because, something that's hyphenated doesn't count, it counts as one word, so I'm wondering, like, when you can, so it's like, would doily kind of be wrong in that regard? I mean, it's like, that's you, like, splitting hairs, but I got caught up in it, because I was like, yeah, I was thinking the same thing too, but it's like, yours still a contraction, so it's like, yeah, you're combining two, you're doing that, but it's still a thing of, it's still combined into one word in this regard. So I don't know. And it's just like, hey, we're trying to listen to Don Juan over here, doily. Like, keep your mouth shut. And it's kind of like, oh, okay. Once again, still kind of being like, hey, Julian's still the bully, and sadly, doily kind of having to still take it even in that story. But which also, once again, direct parallel to the real world, when the dance happened. Archie didn't go with Veronica, or even Betty, he went with his mom. And Archie used that as an excuse of like, oh yeah, for this Valentine's Day thing, like, for Valentine's Day, I'm taking my mom out. It's her first one since my dad passed away. I was like, first and foremost, that's also like super scummy to kind of use your mom's circumstances. And also, like, that's all kinds of jacked up. But also, it's like, oh, who's the person he went out with? Cheryl, of course. It's like, interesting. Especially because Cheryl was literally caught in the middle between Veronica and Betty, kind of fighting over Archie, and especially being like, wait, he told you about that? It's like, oh yeah, the fact is that Betty has to take her. It's like, oh, like, Archie hates being called Archikins. It's like, wait, he told you that? Which I should also note, I think it's so weird that hearing Veronica call Jughead, didn't she call him Juggykins? I was like, oh, that's so weird. I mean, it's obviously like when you think Archykins, like, that's the first one, and yes, there was Reggykins, but it's not as classic. Like, Archykins rolls off the tongue a little bit more. To be fair, we've been hearing it since season 1. Juggykins, I think that's what I think she said Juggykins. I think. Oh, it seems so weird. Like I said, the Reggykins, I just kind of. Did she ever call Reggie Reggykins? Actually, don't remember now. I'm saying this, but I'm like, did she? I feel like I would have noticed that, but maybe I just kind of glossed over it. Because you would think also, because Reggie had his issues with the whole Veronica and Archie thing anyway, so like the last thing you'd want. But I feel like I remember her calling him Reggykins, but I don't remember now. Either way, I just think it's interesting that, like, despite the back and forth between both of them, Cheryl still went out with him. It's like, you kind of know he's kind of a scumbag, but he's a sweet-talking scumbag. And Betty and Veronica decided to get the revenge on him. It's like, hey, you could have both of us at the same time. And they took him to the wood shop, and they cut him in half. And it's like, oh, both of us get to keep one half of him. We no longer have to share him. It's like, well, that's obviously very, very twisted. But, once again, Veronica not too happy with these stories, because for her it's like, wow, you kind of made all the women in your story kind of suck. He's like, and Jughead's like, well, no, that's just, it's a comic book, it doesn't mean anything. It's like, I mean, I get it, you take, like, licenses when you're doing the story. It's like, yeah, it doesn't, but I could see from Veronica's perspective why it seems like that comes from somewhere. I mean, yes, the first story really depicted the guys as douchebags, and so is Archie depicted as a douchebag in a lot of those stories. But it is kind of like, yeah, you kind of depicted, especially in the last 2 stories, it kind of depicted the ladies as kind of like shallow, and it's just like, once again, is that just a time frame situation, But for him, it's like, yeah, like, Jughead's like, I showed the guys in a terrible light, too. The guys were despicable. And she's like, yeah, but that is still you admitting that you were still demonizing the women. And that was a major, because the entire time, like, Veronica was like, no, let's go. And she was kind of laying down major hints, even being like, yeah, pretending I'm being this into comic books to kind of get a guy's attention. But Jughead was so caught up in his stuff that he didn't notice. And sadly, that kind of sucked the air right out of the room, and Veronica left, and they just aren't the same. Like, it's kind of sad. It's like, oh. So I wonder, is that kind of implying, like, that's why I'm wondering, like, is that, because, once again, he's got to be in the season, but he's probably not going to be till later on. Maybe he's going to come up a lot sooner than I think. It's all Reggie of it all. Maybe Reggie and Veronica will fully be a thing, whereas like the Betty and Archie becomes the thing. Like maybe that's where that kind of goes, like going forward. So, I mean, because obviously the last time in the original timeline last season, Reggie and Veronica weren't together anymore. It was kind of like a very, toxic and messed up situation. But either way, so we'll see how that kind of plays out, if that's the direction they ultimately end up going, especially now that... And once again, it's kind of like the Jughead and Veronica thing never became a thing in the original timeline. Now it's like it kind of came and went, sadly. And they had such commonality and things could have worked out, but, Jughead's like, oh, she took it the wrong way. It's like, yeah, but, stories could, it's like, once again, it could be seen as like, oh, that's kind of how you view things. Like, those stories don't just kind of come out of nowhere. You're like, yes, you're spicing it up by adding these horror themes, but, like, the theme, the messages you're trying to get across had to come from you to some extent, right? So, I don't know. It is kind of sad. And obviously it comes at the worst time that Jughead's writing these type of stories and even getting his name written in the byline inside of the books in print. Once again, his boss saying, hey, girls come and go, but your name written down meaning something, all that lasts forever. Worst time considering we have the principal, that psychologist, counselor dude, and the and Clifford all gathering trying to figure out. Well, because word about them, obviously they touched on the Ethel of it all, like, right, she's been quiet at this, with the Sisters of Quiet Mercy, obviously by point, but the thing is, the Muggs murder thing isn't going away, so they needed a new outlet. Well, the psychologist is kind of leaning in towards, this is all started because the teen violence and all this debauchery and stuff is because of comics. Obviously, it's like, which I'm sure there was still kind of some of that in real life. I'm sure that's based on real life, because obviously everything's had its spotlight for being the demonizing thing. The more modern take for that is video games. But obviously, we saw with Stranger Things, which that was also a real thing, was the satanic panic of, Dungeons and Dragons is satanic. And so I'm sure, like, comic books were seeing that as, I don't know, maybe certain comic books were seen that way. And now Jughead's in a position where just when they're really leaning into it, because the doctor put out like an article in the news talking about the dangers of the comics and stuff like that, and going after the people whose names are written in them, which Jughead's now is. So he's going to get dragged into the mud with all of this, especially because they're aiming for like companies in general, but more so like Pep Comics, considering that's a more local brand and stuff. So very, very interesting developments on that front. I do like that. Once again, it is kind of like its own isolated storyline because of all that, but it also has its implications, like, once again, like the Riverdale situation, but it, in this regard, it's just the aftermath of what this means for Jughead, considering everything. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see ultimately where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.